I'd love to invite our keynote speaker, Anne Wojcicki. Many of you may have heard her name or heard of 23andMe, and if in case you haven't, you will now. We're so excited to have Anne here with us this morning. Anne is, as hopefully you've seen, the CEO and co-founder of 23andMe, and really her life's mission, as I think you'll see, has really been how to empower consumers, which hopefully they don't actually become patients, to really have access to their own information directly, and that has been a very interesting story, and at times challenging, and at times really successful. And so we're really excited for her to teach us about her experience and what she's doing and hopes to do in the future as it applies to access to genetic information. So welcome, Anne. Thank you for being here.
I have this horrible habit of always watching presentations coming early at a conference, and then I have to redo my slides, which is why they actually are updating, because I saw some new stuff and then I wanted to change it. So this is also the worst conference for me to go to. So I was seeing one of my doctors when I was pregnant actually is here, and I told her, I was like, oh, I want to have another baby now. So it's also really not good for me to be here. So one of the things that's actually been great, being listening to these talks here, is there's kind of this question that I always think about in healthcare. I was an investor in healthcare companies for a long time, and after investing in healthcare companies for 10 years, and even based on my own experience, it kind of begged this question of who's actually in charge? And I had this other passion where I was fascinated by the fall of communism, and I went and moved to Poland in 1992. And I kind of started to feel like, patients are kind of treated like communist citizens. They're sort of seen as there's Big Brother there, and if you want to know what to do, you ask them, but you're not actually really in charge. But there's this bigger system that tells you what you're supposed to be doing. And it kind of begged the question of well, who's actually in charge? Because I want to be in charge. And the more I would invest in healthcare companies, I realized well, they all think they're in charge, and we get in these debates sometimes of who owns the data and who's making decisions, and I realize it's kind of the dirty secret of healthcare, but none of us are actually really in charge. There's all these other systems in place that make decisions, and part is because there's this odd system, it's not self-pay, there are all these other systems that are making the decisions, and they have that right to make those decisions because they're the ones paying. So kind of that question of who's in charge. One of the things I realized, though, is my family's always been slightly different. This is actually a quote from my medical record from Kaiser, and it says, "Note, this mother has had a hard time being rational, as most of us in pediatrics know." I got this, I love this so much because, we only found this, my sister's at UCSF too, I only found this, and she's the one who found it. We're so aggressive, we just are so interested in taking care of ourselves, and we've been fired by doctors all the time. I always tell people, you don't like the doctor? Just move on. Find another. There's a lot of doctors out there. No, it doesn't work, move it. And so part of the question is why was my mom so kind of unusual in this day and age? Why was she so aggressive? And so this is a picture of my mother and her little brother David. And unfortunately, David died when he was 18 months old. And what happened is that David ate a bottle of aspirin. And they took him to 5 different doctors from hospital to hospital. And my mother was there watching them take him from place to place. And they were told at each place, nothing wrong with him, he's fine, don't worry about it. And they finally have him take a nap. And then they finally, at the last place, got a doctor to take him overnight. And my grandmother, I actually have this whole letter that my grandmother wrote to the doctor. I remember him screaming, and they took him and they closed the door and they said, call in the morning. And they called in the morning, they said, your son is in the morgue. And the lack of patient, interaction, the way they were treated. And my mom, being only, I think, 5 years old at the time, was I will never let myself be taken advantage in that way. And that if you don't take, my mom used to hammer this into ourselves all the time, if you don't take care of yourself, no one will. And that you have to be your own advocate. So it really came down to me, I realized, like, and more in my own experiences, like, no one cares about your health as much as you. And that if you are not advocating yourself, you are at risk for so many issues. And that we need, if we really want to change healthcare, part of it is like empowering people actually to take charge of their own health. So a little history about 23andMe. Obviously the Genome Project, when it came out, was super inspiring to me. Like this idea that like understanding your genetics, like information would not be generic. Like we're all told the exact same thing. Don't smoke, eat better, exercise. It's so generic. It's like, of course no one follows it. And so this idea that it could actually be like, hey, some of you are at high risk for macular degeneration, going blind, and these are things you can do. And some of you are at risk for type 2 diabetes, and this is what you should focus on. And obviously we see this as people age. Like not all 50-year-olds are the same. So what do they need? How do we think about this? Like not everyone should get a mammogram necessarily at 40, but who should? Like no one wants to go and spend their free time actually doing all these extra tests. Like if it's a sunny day in San Francisco, got better things to do than like going get extra mammograms. Like so finding out, can genetics be this tool to help us personalize what, like the healthcare that we're getting, and then knowing those risks. If I actually know what I'm at risk for, then what would I actually do? So I was so inspired by Francis. But then I started to realize also after about 10 years, like nothing was happening. Like there was no adoption of genetics. And so we launched 23andMe with this idea that we want to enable people to get access to it. Like it seems so, that's the FDA listening to me. It seems so obvious, like it's your information. It's like getting your weight on a scale. To me, it just seems so obvious. People should get access to it. And so we launched this in 2008, and it was like definitely greeted with a ton of fanfare. We were on front page article of New York Times and Wired magazine, and we were best invention of the year. We got tons of publicity about it. But there were some concerns. I have never had so many meetings where people have stood up and walked out on me. And so some of it is, there's definitely this worry, like, oh, you're going to tell people something. What are they going to do? Like, knowledge can be really dangerous. Like, they might make irrational choices after this. There's definitely the question of like, what's the clinical utility? Like, we kind of went between these two extremes of the genetic information is so powerful, it's dangerous to give to them, and then this idea that like, oh, it's so meaningless, what are you gonna do? So we kind of toggled between those two things. And then there was a bunch of sort of perceived issues about how what people would do, and there was all the questions about the privacy. Privacy is gonna be compromised, or that like consumers are just gonna be interested in earwax. Like, are people really interested in any of these things? And that is it actionable? Something like, being genetically at risk for Alzheimer's, is that actionable? And just because a physician can't necessarily write a prescription or do something for you, does that mean it's not actionable to a consumer? And so there's all these types of questions. And so this was kind of the reality. The reality is that people love being empowered. They love having this information. They love tweeting it and blogging it and putting it on Facebook. And it was one of those things where I remember people, after they started seeing, people would post their genetic results on Facebook. And people were like, well, is that allowed? Like, of course it's allowed. It's their own information. They can do whatever they want with it. But they started posting and like talking about it and sharing it. And we live in this HIPAA culture where like it's sort of seen as like no one wants to share anything. And I just challenge that. Like, I think people, if you're sick, you want like any doctor, like help me, just like get access to it. And that people actually do want to share their information with family or with others. And so there's this question, like people are actually doing all this stuff with it. And then there is this research component that we have, and we're actually making discoveries. We were sort of thought to be, oh, this is just going to be a fishing expedition. And we're like, well, we're actually making discoveries in the genome with a crowdsource approach. And then last, we're like, all these people are actually making changes. They get the genetic information, the idea that we had that like, oh, wow, we personalized a little bit more, and wow, it's suddenly more meaningful. People are like they actually want to execute on that. And so then we also have some of these groups that came out that like, many people are interested in this, like, wow, like they're interested even if I can't necessarily treat you. Things like that were so overwhelming to people, like the ApoE, the Alzheimer's risk. People actually want to do stuff. Like they want this information, and maybe they make lifestyle changes. And then this was a paper out of Harvard by Robert Greene, and this is one of my favorite papers where he actually showed what percentage, he studied these people for years and showed that like over 40% of people are getting this and having that aha moment where it's like, wow, I actually want to change my behavior. Like they're looking to either change their diet or their exercise, and that like, is this an opportunity to get people aware and say like, hey, based on your DNA, you potentially are in control of some of the things happening in your life. Like one of the papers that just came out, I think it was New England Journal, about heart disease. And I don't know if any of you guys have read this one, but it was showing people who are genetically at higher risk for heart disease, but then if they really change their behavior, they can mitigate their risk for heart disease. So it shows, like, I can tell someone that they have a genetic risk factor. Same thing with the type 2 diabetes. There was a 2001 article about this as well. I can tell you that you have a genetic risk factor, and behavior changes actually reduce your risk. And so we find this is super motivating for people. So today, what's the reality today? So without a doubt, we went from an era where I literally couldn't walk into a genetic counseling conference without the pitchforks coming out. And then, in 2015, they actually came out saying, people kind of have the right to get this information and make decisions. And like more and more the tide is turning, like people can get it. And then even the FDA, we've had sort of a famous interactions with the FDA where we did get a warning letter from them, and then we did work to get an approval, and we actually got an approval from them saying the FDA believes that in many circumstances it's not necessary for consumers to go through a physician or a genetic counselor. That, wow, we can potentially trust people more and more to get this information on their own and learn and do things. Like, wow. So, and part of the reason the FDA was okay with it is that we did this huge user study of 667 random individuals of all different education levels all throughout the country, and we showed that they can actually understand this information. And one of my hypotheses, my father's a particle physicist, and he's lovely, but he has this habit of not explaining things that well. And I asked him once, like, what's the difference between an expanding universe and an inflating universe? And he's like, well, one's expanding and one's inflating. I'm like, wow, thanks, Dad. And so part of my mission here has always been to say, you know what? Anyone can be a scientist. You don't have to have the white coat or the degree, like anyone, just like get your hands dirty, start playing with stuff. Like there's this elitism that drives me crazy. Like we can all understand it, anyone. It's like, it's our environment, it's understanding in our environment. And I'm always amazed, like when you talk about also your story, it's like someone who's been sick. I used to work at NCI, like you see people who have been sick and they have no education background, and the degree with which they become capable of understanding their disease and the treatments and the outcomes is spectacular. And if only we empowered people to actually understand it and believed in them, they would rise to the occasion. So we showed that we have over 90% comprehension for our product. And I think the conclusion that we had here was, oh, there's my sister. She has a habit of coming to my talks late. Consumers want to learn about genetics and they want to understand what it means. Like overwhelmingly, we find that people are interested in DNA. They actually want to learn about themselves. They want to be engaged, and it's our opportunity to actually engage them. So our mission is to help people access, understand, and benefit from the human genome. The access is a really important thing. It's why we are direct-to-consumer. We're the only direct-to-consumer company out there. We fight a really fierce battle to make sure that we are direct-to-consumer. We also make sure that it's affordable. So it's $99 for an ancestry product, and it's $199 for a health and ancestry. So we've really tried to make it's at least in the realm of affordability. We try to make it super easy for people to understand. And learn from it and know what do you potentially do next. And then last is this idea of benefit, and that really taps into our research. So we currently today, we have 35 carrier status, we have a bunch on ancestry, we have a bunch of reports on wellness, and then things like traits. And one thing that I find that researchers have often overlooked is that all this research on Parkinson's and cancer and whatnot is interesting, but let me tell you, people love our cilantro report. they can relate to the idea that like some people think it tastes like soap and some people love it. And so like that's part of how you get people engaged, is like relate to a level of like there's that fourth grade mentality where it's like, I can do this and you can do that and are you double jointed anywhere? Like people love exploring this and understanding and seeing like there's this beauty of human diversity and the long tail of humanity, and like how can we capture that and how can we teach people about it? And we do that with having these reports about traits. So we also do ancestry. Ancestry is overwhelmingly interesting to every single person out there. Whatever people think that they know about their ancestry, it's always a little bit different. And it's so interesting for people to see. Like, we're actually all genuinely really related to each other. Like, it's amazing. And we have these tools like Last Common Ancestor. You know, any two of us could come together and see when's our last common ancestor and seeing what parts of the world they're from. And this is a service that gets better and better over time as we get more reference populations and we can actually start to understand better and better where exactly are you from in the world. So the research side of what we do, and again, this taps into this idea of we want people to benefit from the human genome. We want people to really, like in 10 years, it should just keep getting better and better and better, and that the genetic information should keep improving our lives. So the way it works is we crowdsource. Like this is entirely, like we try to say, like we are the people's research company. Like we live and die upon, you know, the 1 million+ people we have in our database who are participating in research. And my original idea when I heard about studies like Framingham and other projects was like, wow, Framingham, you know, it's a survey. You go in, like, couldn't you just do that online? You heard of the web? And there's all these programs where it's like you send out a letter and you ask people to fill it. Like there's this 1 million women study in the UK, and it's Scantron, and they send out this letter to 1 million people, and then there's like a team of retired individuals like just opening up Scantrons, and I was like, there's the web, you could do this. There's, you know, SurveyMonkey, others, there's us. So we combine all that survey information with the genetics to make discoveries. So a couple important things for those of you more technical: we are IRB approved. It's an opt-in. It's a super broad consent form. It is not phenotype specific. And again, that was one of the things that drove me crazy when I look at clinical trials, and you consent people for this really narrow subject, but people have so many different interesting aspects. And so you have a schizophrenia study, but you learn something, you know, maybe you're also diabetic, and why not use them also then for a diabetic study? So the fact that we was really important to us to not be phenotype specific. Customers can opt out anytime. They can stop being a participant. And the data is like when we do research on it, it's aggregated and anonymized. So advantages of online research is that I'm not dependent on who's just walking in my door. I go online. I can get thousands of people. We have a project that we did with the state of Nevada and Renown and Desert Research Institute, and they were looking to get 5,000 people for a study, and they were shocked because they actually got 5,000 people in 24 hours, and then they had to expand it to 10,000 people, and they got 10,000 people in the next 48 hours, and they're like, wait a minute, we can't afford this anymore. But it just shows that the power of being online, you can get people want to participate. So this is what our types of questions look like. It's just super, super simple. One thing that we've learned is in some ways, like, it's different than a medical record. You don't need to over-phenotype individuals. I can sometimes, like, we have this one study that we did on morning, like whether you're a morning person or an evening person, and all we did was ask, like, are you a morning person? And we didn't, the head of my research team is so fascinating. He's like, you didn't even define, what does it mean to be a morning person? We're like, yeah. We just asked people, are you a morning person or a night person? And we found all these genetic associations in genes associated with the circadian rhythm. Like, in some ways, there's a simplicity of, like my sister, we talk about doing research projects. I'm like, I bet if you just ask people, like, do they eat bacon and drink soda? Like, what is that predictive of? Like, that must be associated with something. Like, it has a definition of different types of eating patterns. So, like, do you actually need, like, a daily diary and the level of detail that we're thought to think about it? Or can you simplify questions in such a way? And this is something, because we have so many people in the database, we can experiment with and we can keep understanding. So this is an example of what we did. This was a cancer survey that we put out. And you can see we got 25,000 responses in the first 24 hours. So again, for a company, like for us that wants to do research, and you think about most research studies today are hundreds to thousands of people. Like, for us to get this kind of research that quickly is amazing. And then we actually got 100,000 responses in 6.5 weeks. So like just huge numbers that we can get in our research. So types of data that we can get, from diagnoses to, like, we ask about where are you living, health behaviors like are you smoking cigarettes, medication is a big one. That's a big pet project of mine, like just understanding how do people respond to medications. Environmental exposures is also something I'm super interested in, and looking at family history of disease. So we can get all kinds of different data here. There's definitely a big push lately, actually, for people to start studying marijuana now that it's legal, and actually what are those impacts of actually what is the drug-drug interaction of that with all these other medications. So we now have over 1 million people. Over 80% of our customers consent for research, which is one of those things people keep asking, like, why? Why do they consent? I'm like, they do. So for all kinds of reasons that I will keep talking about. And we have almost 500 million research questions answered. I mean, it's just a massive amount of data. Demographics, people always think like, oh, you probably just have all these like young Silicon Valley people. And we have some of them. It's still mostly European, but we're making significant efforts to keep increasing the diversity. But the average age is roughly 50. And it's roughly half male and half female. So we actually, like, we're making strides. We can always keep getting better, but it's actually slightly more diverse than what some people think. So this was a slide that I had to throw in last minute just to show, like I was sitting with Kristen, who's from my company as well, and I was saying, I was like, wow, I wonder how many people we actually have, and what is this research that we have today. So we have 28,000 people who've actually been Europeans, who've been a control, who say they have not had premature birth, and then we have 3,200 who've said they have. And then, you know, in East Asian, 65, African American, 195, Latino, 305. So we already have a good number of people who've said that they've had premature birth. So it's part of also what I say, like, we're kind of, there's so much data now that we have, and then you can start to look at all these individuals, and we could do what we call a PheWAS study, where we see what are other phenotypes, other characteristics associated with people who've had premature birth. And because we have all this health and like lifestyle data, well, maybe it's related to a full moon, or maybe it's related to the bacon, or maybe it's related to, you know, again, there's obviously the genetic components. So we can start to do all kinds of different analyses in this. And for me, the goal was always to say, how can we just make research as simple as running a Google query? Just do a search. And for me, like, this is literally what I just did this morning, like, hey, how many people we got who have premature birth? So I think we get this question all the time as to why do people participate? Like, why do you have 500 million phenotype points? Why do you have 80% consent rate? And it's because I hate this idea of being a research subject. Like, who wants to be a subject? It sounds horrible. And that's where we really look at our customers. Like, we don't call them patients. They're customers, and we look at them as partners. And for me, it was always, when we set up this company, I was like, listen, if we do something that's bad, people should walk with their feet. Like, people always have the ability to just leave a research project, whereas you don't always have that for other studies that have happened. But our customers, they don't like something we do, trust me, they threaten to like revoke their consent. So we have to listen to our customer. This is a true partnership that we have with our customers. And what we find is, like, engaging people long term is what enables discovery. We can make all these discoveries because people are engaged. We give them the ancestry. We have a feature called Relative Finder. We're continuously updating with new reports. We keep them engaged. So a couple examples. This is my favorite paper. This is the oldest, one of the oldest papers we have. It's the efficient replication of over 180 genetic associations. To me, what this showed this idea that you can collect a ton of data, and in one fell swoop, you can do a giant genetic study, that you can actually just replicate tons of genetic findings just in one massive data set. And so for me, it shows the idea that you can actually do sort of data in scale, like parallel processing all of this research. This is one that just recently came out that I love, because depression is a really hard area to do research on. And this was something that we've always been interested in, was a partnership with Pfizer. And it's amazing. We have 450,000 people who participated. And if you think about the idea of actually running a specific study just for depression and saying, I need to recruit 500,000 people, it would be unfathomably expensive. But if these 450,000 people are just, it happened to be in the database, and then our average customer contributes to over 200 studies. So they're being, like, every one of us is so interesting. You can contribute in so many different ways. So we only can do this kind of research because people are participating in lots and lots of different studies. So estimates of penetrance, this is another one that to me is one of the big issues that's going to come up, and some of you who have genetics background will understand this better, is that we know that there's different, there's like a BRCA mutation, a breast cancer associated mutation. We know that there's lots of these mutations that exist, but we don't necessarily know how penetrant they are, meaning we don't necessarily know how many of the people who have that mutation are actually going to get the disease. And this was a study that was actually done by the Broad and was really interesting. She actually happens to have this prion disease, which is a horrible disease, or her mother died of it, and she's a carrier for it. And so she went to the Broad, she quit her job at Google, and she went to the Broad to start doing research on it. And we gave her access to our data, and she was able to look at a number of genetic associations in the genes associated with prion disease, but saw that they have such a frequency in the population that they're just not likely to be actually causative genes, causative mutations for the disease. And so a number of people who had been told that they potentially have this terminal illness no longer actually have this terminal illness. And so it's one of the things that you can do with lots and lots of people is actually understand how likely is it that someone is actually going to go and get this disease. So we also, for me, part of this idea of benefit was completing the full circle. Because for me, one of the things that frustrates me with a lot of the foundations that are out there is that people talk and talk and talk, and they publish, but what actually happens? At the end of the day, like the father of my children, his family is all at high risk for Parkinson's disease. And I love that there's like lots of papers coming out, but I kind of just want either a treatment or a prevention or a cure. Like, papers are great, but if they don't lead to action, it's not really interesting to me. And so it was hard for us to actually convince pharma companies that, that all of this data, starting with a human data set, is actually going to lead to better drug development. So I said, fine, I'll just hire my own drug development team. And so we hired Richard Scheller, who ran drug development for Genentech for 15 years. He was a professor at Stanford before that. And he is mining the data. He has a 20-person team now. We're setting up labs in South San Francisco. We have 6 targets that we've found from the database. And the hypothesis is that we can actually develop drugs faster and cheaper because we're starting with humans and human database, and we have so much data. And most of the drug industry is starting with sort of research from either like bacteria or from mice. And we actually have humans, and as much as you're similar to mice, you're just more similar to each other. And so, I was about to make a political comment, but I'm holding back. So we hired Richard. And what we found is there actually is some data out there that show that drugs with a human genetic are one to 2 times more likely to succeed. And I think this is something that we're really looking to play out even more. Can we actually reduce the cost of the drug development cost from like the $2 billion that it is to something that is reasonable, and can we actually do it in a much faster time scale? So there's still a lot more work to be done. As much as I think that we've been able to change this conversation about the consumer and how we should actually give the information to them, and it's no longer seen as such a debate that an individual is entitled to their own genetic data, I just want to give a little bit of history and then recognize still where we're at. So this is a paper that I love. I find it so fascinating that in 1961, JAMA did a study asking physicians whether or not they would tell their patients they have cancer. And over 90% of those physicians said they would not tell their patients they had cancer. So as much as I can complain about where we are today, we've still come a long way. And so we've made progress, but that again goes back to this idea of the communist patient, and that we were sort of treated in this way that like we're not going to tell you anything. And this was a Nature article that just came out November 1st, and saying like the status quo today is still not to give people back their own data from a clinical study. And it is controversial, and I think that's part of the whole debate here in terms of some of the premature, the potential genetic tests that are out there. What do you do with this? And there's such a debate about this, and more I just feel like people want this information, and that people actually can rise to the challenge and know what to do, and that we can actually, it's important for us to keep studying what are the actions and what people are doing with it, but that when we give people information and we trust them with it, they do rise to the occasion. So the question I leave with all of you is really how can we change the way we look at patients and empower them to take more charge of their health? Thank you.